End of excessive tourism. Perspectives on sustainability of mass tourism. Mobility has been challenged by COVID-19. Transportation system paralyzed and international labor borders closed. With carefree travel in distance, since past excess in tourism is subjected to criticism, and because post-pandemic tourists would be stressed by crowds, destinations have no choice but rethink their futures. Today, we are going to talk about the old norm and the new norm, and what are the choices for the era of post-pandemic. As it has been asked by many of SCoT followers during last year, and we have always emphasized on this important question. Today, we have a special team with the 33rd volume of SCoT webinars. We are with you today with Professor Harold Peckler. Professor Harold is a professor of tourism and head of Center of Entrepreneurship at the Catholic University of Eichstätt Ingolstadt, Germany, and head of the Center for Advanced Studies at the European Academy of Bozen. Professor Harold, the floor is yours, and we are eager to hear from you and your wonderful team today. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just try now to, now you should see it.
Perfect.
Thank you, Kazem. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We are happy to meet together and to talk a little bit about the future of tourism. We do it in a more specific way, discussing about perspectives on sustainable mass tourism. And there is a central question behind, is excessive tourism coming to an end? There is a question, what is excess? What is excess? Or is an excessive tourism existing? Excess, in my personal opinion, would be immorality, exorbitance, debauch, transgression. We have a lot of names a lot of interpretations of excess. And well, the first question is obviously, what is excessive tourism, and is excessive tourism still existing? One thing should be clear. We talked intensively about overtourism and overcrowding before the COVID crisis came into the world. And now overtourism and overcrowding has become a new meaning. We are becoming more sensitive, more sensible. And that what overcrowding was before COVID-19 crisis, it's probably not anymore the same as now. So something is changing, and probably also perspectives on sustainable mass tourism are changing. Allow me to show you in a very short time just a couple of slides in order to introduce in the topic, since we have a great panel with many different experiences. And so I hope that we can discuss in an intensive way the perspectives on sustainable tourism, and especially the perspectives on sustainable mass tourism. We had in Europe the case of Ischgl. Ischgl is a wonderful place in the Austrian Alps. And many of you and us know Ischgl, well-known ski resort, but the spreading of the COVID-19 virus was also part of the success of Ischgl, I would even say. So many guests brought the virus in many parts of the continent. And then a big discussion started about the resilience, about the crisis, the robustness of ski resorts with special consideration to Ischgl. But we had the same with the Oktoberfest. This is a famous big event in Munich, in Bavaria. So this is about masses. Probably today we see this kind of masses in a different way. Is this the tourism we want to have? No doubt that the Oktoberfest is contributing in a very positive way to the brand and the image of the destination of the city of Munich, but also of Bavaria as a whole. And with Richard Adam, we have within the panelists the former managing director of the Bavarian Tourism Board. Mallorca, the so-called German Ballermann and British Magaluf. So what about mass tourism on the Spanish islands? Mallorca is only one example. It doesn't matter whether we are going in the Alps or on the islands of the Mediterranean. Some definitions or some developments of mass tourism we can see, and very often there is a big debate and a discussion about the future of tourism in that kind of destinations. Last but not least, another example: party tourism at Miami Beach. So, what is excess again when we talk about these kinds of developments? Sensation seeking can be one axis to have a better understanding. On one hand, the thrill of adventure seeking, on the other hand, the adventure seeking, but then also the disinhibition was the name used for the items describing the need to disinhibit behavior in the social sphere by drinking, partying, and seeking variety, for example, in sexual activities. And last but not least, boredom, susceptibility, just to give you some ideas about one possibility, one theoretical possibility to have a better understanding of that, what we're talking about. No doubt, overtourism was a starting point in the pre-COVID crisis when we discussed also overcrowding. Overtourism and overcrowding, as we know, is not the same. So probably overtourism is following the overcrowding situation when we talk about the negative perception of societies in confront of tourism. So there are also a lot of different cases. And just recently in the German Competence Center for Tourism, we discussed the now a new inspirational stage. People like quiet place, so they like to experience different ways of vacation now. And you see down, when you look at the travelers line, parties and nightlife at the moment are not considered important tourism activities. Just to give you a small example, looking at businesses and travelers. Finally, we have to discuss about, when we talk about sustainability, then we have to talk about resilience. So in what way are we able to create a new robustness of tourist destinations, where destinations with their networks remain flexible, but on the other hand, create a new learning ability and to adapt to changing circumstances and to learn from crisis. There is a central question when we talk about resilience: bounce back or bounce forward? So as the longer the crisis is going on, the less the chance is given that we will have a situation which we could call bounce back. Definitely we will come out in a completely new situation, and transformation is going on now. We cannot stop the transformation on different levels now. But we certainly have an influence on what we want and what we do not want. So tourism managers, tourism destination managers have big challenges. On one hand, responsibilities to create, let me say, to go with the transformation, but at the same time to innovate the tourism product, using the crisis as an opportunity to change things, to create new products and innovation, and to establish awareness and trust. And so destination resilience is an outcome from, let me say, a context which we could eventually call organizational resilience, regional resilience, but embedded in the resilience, in the perception of a resilience of societies with special focus to ecological aspects. And so therefore the question, how can we reorientate our tourism? Rejection of access tourism in Mallorca, that was the question mark in this specific case. Or the historical opportunity of some places when they look back at their central big events. Very often they want to get away from the party image. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a great panel. And I'm very happy that all of the colleagues accepted my invitation to be part of this short but hopefully interesting panel, hopefully interesting discussion. And so I'd like to introduce now the first speaker, who is Richard Adam. He's an international council member of the so-called World Tourism Forum Institute and Global Tourism Forum. He's a former director, managing director of the Bavarian Tourism Board. So Bavaria is the biggest federal state of Germany, and from a touristic point of view, the most important federal state in Germany. He's an expert in development, management, and investment. So a real businessman, I would say. And Richard is covering this business competence in this panel, probably more than we are. So specializing, obviously now in the post-COVID stage on recovery and governance missions. 20 years reporting at board level, digital advocate, media trained, well-proven public speaker, endlessly curious. Richard, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks a lot, Harald. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. And I appreciate Harald's entrance presentation because it gives a lot more room for me. So I don't need any definitions. I don't need any more examples of the actual issue, because I'm not, I don't belong to the scientific community. I do know a couple of rules of the scientific community, but as I don't belong there, I have the freedom of expressing unsolicited own thoughts and observations. Some time ago, I was kind of sick and tired about the discussions of the tourism industry during the COVID, because it all did go in the same direction, basically restoring the same, when it's time to restore the same situation again as we had pre-COVID. And I wrote an article, A Road to Resilience, which is free to download on my LinkedIn webpage. And that's probably should have been given the structure of my presentation here, but I changed the I can't get into presentation, here it is. That changed the flow a little bit. So, Road to Resilience, leveraging overtourism into sustainability and regional welfare, because this is, to me, more important, how to convert overtourism into sustainability. You would all agree that tourism prior to the pandemic wasn't perfect either. A couple of examples, due to inexpensive airfares and tourism consumer climate, tourism has grown globally for decades, and all the tourist people will clap themselves on their own shoulders for actually have stimulated growth. But to me, the growth comes from the economic and consumer climate. What has to be said is that the average spending per trip hasn't grown, even despite inflation. We have seen popular places having lost authenticity and gained sameness to a great extent. I come to that at a later extent. Also, I have the feeling, it's a feeling, destination management and stewardship is focused on primarily on promotion. And what we take as the key indicator to measure the success in tourism is primary visitor numbers. So what do visitor numbers really say in terms of generating regional welfare? Infrastructure developments, quantity-oriented, volume before value, and climate change and ethical aspects require consequences. That was prior to the pandemic already. So does it make sense to restore an obsolete system? I put this in a really simple model of a healthy, viable tourism positioning. According to Albert Einstein, if you can't explain it simple, you haven't understood it well enough. So this is a very simple thing, what I have here. A viable and healthy tourism positioning, to me, consists of attractiveness, retention and advocacy, and sustainability. I'm going to elaborate this within a couple of minutes. But then here is this nasty phenomena of mass excess, overcrowding, overtourism. What I'm aware, these are different things. Mass tourism and excess tourism and overcrowding are different things. And I leave the definition to the scientific community. So I don't bother with that. I do have a certain idea that what the difference is. But anyway, this obviously has an effect on either retention and advocacy, but even more so on sustainability. And I would like to explore that effect and maybe find a couple of things to smooth it down a little. Number one is we have to go into a little bit more detail. What is attractiveness really made of? As we all know, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so it's attractiveness. Number one, attractiveness, it doesn't start with actually awareness or being well known. It starts by being well known for something, which is, to me, I would instead of awareness, I would like to see the term relevance. A relevance to visit a place. And it's based on a real value creation for a special interest. I have a family with 4 kids. They're all grown up now, but when they are small, it doesn't really matter whether the area is beautiful or not. It also matters of what you really do for family with kids in their specific interest. For example, now today, we use the term digitalization. I think every one of us 4 to 5 times a day, but digitalization doesn't mean what is technically doable. It's also what you really create in a product innovation, but also to satisfy special interests. And that's a big difference, because between technical doability and creating new value is a big difference. Then sometimes in digitalization, people just source out and let visitors do the work. So we are absorbed by increasingly digitalization, and there will be a time again where you will be seeking digital detox, especially when you're on vacation, where you talk to a human person again and not making your input in some sort of a tablet. So this is for me a term of relevance. Another term of attractiveness is for me identity. Identity of a place. And here we have 2 different things. Every place has an identity. It can be bad, it can be good. But if you go there as a traveler, you look for authenticity, things you don't find elsewhere. A couple of misdevelops over the last 10 to 20 years is franchise copycats that destroy authenticity. Authenticity can either be cultural, nature, uniqueness, or it can also be artificial. I mean, Disneyland has a high authenticity. It can be artificial, and Disney is doing a great job to maintaining this. But when there are franchise copycats coming in, especially when mass tourism in a certain development pattern is relevant, things destroy the authenticity of a place. Now, there is nothing wrong with McDonald's or Starbucks. I go to these places occasionally myself, and I always, until today, I survived. But we have a much bigger leverage here. For example, hotel chains. In the old days, the big hotel giants, Marriott, Hilton, IHG, they had a hotel brand for each segment. Then they found out in top spots, name it Hong Kong, Bangkok, New York, Paris, London, once they have sold each of these brands to the real estate owner, they needed new labels to sell so they can leverage more business in hotspots. So it's not a new customer value, it's just a new label to sell. In the experience, I would start to question whether you create an experience. Today, Accor runs 30 labels, Marriott runs about 30 labels. There isn't much differentiation between these labels, and especially we have seen hotels in the US that some hotels have changed the label of different label sellers 8 times in 6 years. So in terms of identity, I question the value that these labels give to a place. We have seen this in an emerging pattern. When tourism emerges, let's say in China, they couldn't get enough of these international labels. Now we go to a new phase of having a more popular tourism also in China, especially domestic. Now they're kicking the labels out because they create their own authenticity again. And also labels do actually create transaction versus experience, because authenticity is going down the drain. That's my personal opinion. It's food for thought to argue whether labels increase authenticity and attractiveness of a place. As a matter of fact, you don't need to go a place to see a Starbucks or a Marriott hotel or any other hotel which you have around the corner. Let's elaborate the next aspect here. What is retention and advocacy, and why is it important? Visitor experience is the driver of retention and advocacy. What you tell your people when you go home and what you post in your social networks when you have visitors a place. So here, reality beats perception. This is the true currency that makes a place strive. Because I asked you the question, what makes a place popular? Is it advertising campaigns? In tourism, they all tell you the same. This place is vibrant. This place is has natural beauty. This place has a rich culture. They all tell you the same. If you exchange the labels in advertising, you wouldn't find the difference anymore, especially when you look at advertising campaigns of big hospitality groups. They all tell you the same, especially when this COVID thing started. They were advertising on their new health and sanitation protocols, though they were exchanging the concept of hospitality with the concept of hospitalization, more or less. So in the end, retention advocacy influences swarm intelligence, and swarm intelligence is what makes a place popular. It's not the advertising campaign, because once the word of mouth isn't working for you, you cannot compensate this with advertising, especially not in a connected world. So that comes to sustainability. When it comes to sustainability, I mean the entire concept of sustainability, not only the ecological, which is kind of overstressed due to the discussions of climate change and environmental pollution, all these kind of things. I also mean an economical sustainability and social sustainability. So we have, on one hand, we have conditions, especially when we talk about mass tourism, overcrowding, overtourism, like increased cost of living for locals, centrifugal forces, increased housing prices, increased land prices, increased pollution, pickpocketing, all these kinds of consequences of overcrowded places. But then again, how do we measure the quality of tourism a place creates out of tourism? And here's the thing: the number of visitors, the number of overnight stays, the number of arrivals is the holy grail of measuring tourism. Despite the fact that science have given a lot of other instruments to tourism communities and tourism regions in order to put this in relation to, let's say, for example, salary, corporate tax, regional reinvestment, carbon footprint, local welfare. You can go on with this list and then create a system of benchmarking in order to see and monitor and steer what kind of tourism you actually have and what's the value they create. Now there is research, there are studies, but there is no KPI system addressing these issues on a regular basis implemented with tourism regions, at least not with the majority. And this is, to me, key in order to steer, monitor, and influence sustainability in all three aspects. And as we know, the increasing impact of sustainable and ethical consciousness will have an increasing influence on booking decisions, because people are aware of these aspects due to swarm intelligence and due to the possibilities you have in your fingertips in mobile digital research. Now here comes the point I'm going to make. In that triangle of attractiveness, retention and advocacy, and sustainability, once you're confronted with mass excess or over-tourism, and I'm very well apart, this is a luxury issue. Most tourism regions are not confronted with over-tourism. As a matter of fact, I've recently heard a politician saying on a conference, if you have over-tourism, give it to us. So this applies only for a few, but these few have a lot of impact on the public perception of tourism. That's why it is even a bigger issue than only dealing with local affairs. To me, once you have over-tourism, overcrowding, it's an indicator that you give things away too cheap to a certain extent. So you need a price tag to leverage contribution for local welfare beyond tourism ecosystem. So mass tourism, excess tourism, but however you call it, overcrowding, over-tourism, has to come with a price tag. Now, having said that, this is full of there's a big potential of misunderstandings. Number one, the idea is not really new. We have bad tax and all these kind of taxation systems. But where does the money go out of this? It goes into promoting tourism and building tourism infrastructure. It doesn't go into the welfare of communities to a certain extent. And misperception or misunderstanding number two is you have to do it smart. You cannot just increase prices and appear to be a rip-off place. In order to do it smart, I give you one example what I mean with it. In the Austrian Alps near Salzburg, there is a little village called Hallstatt. It's a very picturesque, very authentic little village, nestled on a mountain, very compact, and next to a beautiful lake. Now, since the Chinese have built a replica of Hallstatt in China, the place has become tremendously popular, and especially tourist groups from Asia flock into the village. And there is no shopping mall. There is basically not even the cheap souvenir business. They are kind of keeping it under control, and people walk in and out through Hallstatt, which is done in half an hour, which is because it's a small village. But you have these crowds that local people put signs at their door. Please mind that there are still people living here. These people don't create value in Hallstatt because there is not much where you can spend your money there. Now the problem is they're trying to solve it by increasing the parking fees. Then again, increasing a parking fee looks like another rip-off again. So what I have in mind is look at things in a more smarter way, in a more connected way, in order to drive regional value chains. For example, in that area around Hallstatt, they have three mountains that are accessible by cable cars, spectacular views, and they have room for improvement in terms of their frequencies. So why not, for example, as a model, making all these tour operators from Asia, which you know because you do business with them, only get a parking lot if they go to one of these three mountains and use the cable car and buy an additional ticket, create additional value where there is no tourism, and then the state who owns the cable cars makes a contribution to Hallstatt. This is a smarter approach than just increasing the price tag. These kind of things I would have in mind when I say overcrowds need a price tag. Well, we have it now in carbon footprint, that carbon consumption has a price tag. I hope governments will not use it for filling other holes in the budget and use it for environmental technology. But this is the kind of thing I have in mind when I talk about overtourism needs a price tag. Okay,
Richard?
Yeah, I'm almost through.
Okay.
Almost through. So this makes overtourism come into this more into that loop and creates a benefit. Then it maintains in attractiveness, improves the quality. Retention and advocacy will differentiate between cheap and value, and the community gets more welfare out of this overtourism, and at the same time the numbers go down. But prerequisite is a set of KPIs to measure and to develop and to proactively balance the interests. Conclusion, what this has to do with resilience. The real visitor experience is the actual value and the currency that makes people come back or not, and create the advocacy of put the thumbs down and up. So resources have to be focused on value creation. Attractiveness is defined by crowd intelligence. Visitors become more aware of sustainability measures and ethical situations. Places have to maintain authenticity to avoid identity of sameness. In destination and relevant businesses units, there is a higher demand for executives with proven experience in development, restructuring, and recovery, not just the promoters. And post-pandemic traumata, and with the tendencies to avoid crowds, will keep us away from overtourism and overcrowded for some time anyway, but I'm pretty sure it will bounce back once we have this under control, dealing with the virus. And to come to an end, value-oriented visitors may increase social encounters, quality of life, and when attached to a price tag, it can leverage significant additional welfare. Mass excess or overtourism only remains a problem as long as value is given away too cheap, for example, in day tourism, or only a few harvest the profit in local communities to the expense of the cost of living of others. Another aspect, drain of capital out of local tourism profits. Franchisers, real estate owners needs to be reduced, and a set of KPIs beyond visitor number is needed to balance economic, social, and ecological interest. So this was it. Thank you very much. Thanks for Harald for giving me the tolerance level for overdoing it for 2 minutes, I guess. And I hope I could stimulate a little bit food for thoughts for discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. So this was a good basis for, I guess, further presentations. And David, it's an honor to introduce you as a principal research fellow at the Queensland University of Technology, very famous professor of tourism. You have contributed extensively to leading journals. You wrote a couple of very important books with focus to sustainable tourism. I remember Sustainable Tourism Theory and Practice with Taylor and Francis, or Sustainable Tourism, an Advanced Introduction with Elgar. David Weaver is a fellow emeritus of the International Academy for the Study of Tourism, has held a prestigious Yangtze River Scholarship in China, and he was, until his retirement, professor at Griffith University, again in Queensland. David, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being with us. And I'm very, very curious to know what your thoughts and views are on this.
Thanks very much, Harold. I am too. I'm curious about my own views because I find everything is changing very, very rapidly, even in my own thought process. In the interest of time, I think I'll dive right into the presentation. I think it'll be quite brief so that we can have a good discussion time. But let's first of all make sure I can share the screen. Is that good?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, so I read with great interest, Harold, your write-up describing the context and about excessive tourism. And I thought I would center my comments. There's so much to say. It's such a rich topic. So I want to center my comments around essentially a quote from your write-up. Will we return to the old normal of mass tourism? And up to now, I'm kind of hearing almost a consensus of, well, no, of course not. And I'm going to be a bit ornery here and say, okay, why can't I move anything? Yes, there we go. I'm going to say yes. We are going to return to the old normal of mass tourism, but I'm also going to initially perhaps portray that as something quite negative, but ultimately express it as something quite positive. So my comments are based on quite considerable examination I've been doing lately of how government, industry, and the public are responding to two wicked tourism problems. And I think you would all have some idea of what we mean by a wicked problem. This is defined as having a high degree of uncertainty. You're never really clear when you solve it. There's a huge diversity of opinion on this kind of issue, can be usually very ideological. One of them, of these wicked problems, of course, is climate change, which I would describe right now as being in an unfolding crisis state, although that also is, depending where you stand ideologically, it's either a non-issue or it's about to wipe us all out. The other one, COVID-19, which is clearly a deep crisis state with the 80% collapse in international stayover arrivals last year, for example. Well, without getting into the details of these, I'm going to tell you that from my analysis, I've come to 5 conclusions. Well, I see no evidence whatsoever of radical structural change from the top, that it's happened, nor do I necessarily think it should be expected to happen. You know, this is the kind of thing that happens 1917 or 1949. The response to the COVID, many people describe as quite radical, unprecedented shutting down of borders, but actually that's quite conservative. It's being done for public health purposes. And the more salient issue is that virtually every government, virtually every facet of the industry, in other words, the top of the hierarchy in the panarchy, wants to restore the status quo ante as soon as practical. So that's the first observation. We don't get the leadership from the top, but nor do we get the leadership from the bottom. It's largely because there doesn't appear to be much desire for radical change from the bottom. Speaking as an academic over 40 years as a professor, I could say that we have a greatly inflated opinion as to the importance and influence of things like alternative tourism, justice tourism, reconciliation tourism, slow tourism. You mention East industry and most people in general public, and they'll look at you with a blank stare. In the case of COVID, there is, I think, an enormous pent-up desire for restoration of normal travel patterns. So for everyone who endorses kind of digital detox, there must be 1,000 people that can't wait to get back to the theme parks and back onto the cruise ships. So whether it's climate change or COVID, it really doesn't appear that there's much impetus. Flixskam in Sweden, flight chain, which interesting because that appeared in 2017. And by 2019, before COVID was a thing, had virtually no penetration into the Swedish market, which you'd think, well, that would be the obvious place, Scandinavia, for this to really take some traction. That never really occurred. Accordingly, because of these two things, within the panarchy, we're not getting the kinds of reaction, the revolt that we'd expect to have if these crises are so severe. It doesn't mean they're not severe, it's just that there doesn't appear to be much guts, I could say, for any kind of radical change. So there's no, in my opinion, immediate prospect of any kind of radical transformation in either the what to do or the strategies or the how to do it with respect to either climate change or COVID-19. Now, this is where it gets more optimistic. What we can expect is transformative governance. But transformative governance, not as radical change, but as accumulating incremental, small radical changes. Number of ways we can describe this. Opportunistic evolutionary change rather than revolutionary change. Or what I've called in a previous article, a paradigm nudge rather than paradigm shift. So it's transformational governments or transformative governments occurring within the existing, yes, capitalist, pro-growth way of thinking. And I don't see that there's any impetus for something to replace that can accommodate an expected latent demand now of the suppressed demand, I could say, of 10 billion tourist trips a year. So that's going to occur within that dominant pro-growth capitalist paradigm. Important point I'm making here and why I initially say yes to the old normal is that I don't have such a negative opinion about the old normal. I think the old normal was actually, it was reforming, but very, very slowly, and yes, within a capitalist system, because if the tourism doesn't make money, it ceases to exist. It doesn't exist as a charity. So it's happening. I mean, think, for example, the smart tourism phenomenon. Unheard of in 2010, and by 2018, we're hearing nothing but smart destinations. And yes, it's a concerto still in action, still being developed, but it has some very, very promising implications, also some negative ones. But the point is that the tourism of 2019 is a very different thing from 2009. So transformative governments had been occurring under the old paradigm as paradigm nudge. We know the industry is much more green now than it was before. Things like solar panels are things that can happen because they make money without changing or having to change that pro-growth capitalist paradigm. So this was, I believe, the old normal of mass tourism. And if we go back to that, then I think that's actually quite a positive development. Now, transformative governance then is, I think, an organic process. But because things like climate change and COVID are in such advanced crisis stages, I don't think we should be complacent to say, well, yes, this is great. Let's keep this evolving over the next 50 years organically. I think that we do need to expedite it. And just the fact that we put it into a transformative governance context is, I think, a positive step theoretically, because, there's something like 1,000 papers written on that topic, and only about 8 or 9 of them are relevant to tourism and only tangentially. So it's clearly something that can give us kind of an anchor that we can adhere our boat to. So give us some stability, and then see how we can make something more resilient, more adaptable, more sustainable, as both Harold and Richard have been talking about. Now, in order to achieve transformative governance, even within the existing paradigm, I think that there are some desirable character traits that we need to cultivate. This isn't my original thinking. This is from the transformative governance literature. We need the ability, or people that have the ability, to appreciate and integrate multiple perspectives. That's a big one. I know I'm very close with the political situation in the United States, and I've never seen such polarization of opinion because of the social media silos that have been established in the different camps politically. You need the ability to embrace uncertainty. So rather than saying, well, how do we make things more certain? We say we can't. The nature of a wicked problem is inherent uncertainty, and our society is complex. And as we learn more, it just becomes even more complex. So we have to embrace that, not reject it or try somehow to transcend it. We need the ability to experiment. We have to be willing to take risks and to look at, you've mentioned some really good ideas, what they want to do in Austria, you know, to have the people, if you come in, you have to spend some kind of money, for example. That's actually quite radical, but it's a small radical thing that actually could work and make a big difference in the long run. And finally, you have to have the ability to engage in continual reflexive learning. That's a really important one too. Now, I think that there's actually a specific kind of valuescape that's for individuals and organizations that's associated with this. In order to do these, have this ability, these four things, when the industry is hiring people and in universities, when we train managers, I think we need to put a lot more emphasis on what I call the valuescape, which would lead to an accelerated form of non-radical transformative governance. We need to cultivate humility, for example. We need to cultivate curiosity, tolerance, and compassion. I don't remember in my tourism teaching or any program we had at Griffith that we ever mentioned any of these four things. And most importantly, and I know that this was mentioned, I think Harold mentioned the importance of trust. Well, we have to really look at becoming people who are trustworthy and trusting. And that's very difficult, but I think that's the key to everything really. And then a thought comes to my mind that this is not only a valuescape for individuals and organizations, but can we think about the post-COVID destination as also exemplifying this valuescape? Can we think about a destination that trusts you, the tourist, and is also trustworthy? The tourists trust you. Now that's something I've never seen before. How about also, can we think about a destination having humility? Can we think about a destination having tolerance? Can you have such a thing as a curious destination? And can you have such a thing as a compassionate destination? Can you imagine? That to me could be a very, very powerful basis for a new post-COVID concept of destination sustainability. So that's just, again, something I just basically thought of now with some inspiration from the previous speakers. And some research I've done, some of you may be familiar with this. 2014, I introduced the concept of enlightened mass tourism with the idea that why not use a dialectic, sort of a classic resolution-based dialectical approach that combines the best characteristics of mass tourism. And whatever you want to say about mass tourism, there are some really positive things inherent to it. The economies of scale that allow 10 billion people to realize their bucket list destination trips and to be happy. Competitive innovation, the fact that a Marriott competes with the Hilton. Well, if it's in a context of trustworthy in this valuescape, then this can be incredibly fruitful for the kinds of innovations that we need here, these small radical innovations for transformative governance. And alternative tourism. The best characteristics are things like the ethical imperative, the sensitivity to place and community. Because one thing I have to say here, there are some academics who are already talking about the need to, in essence, rejuvenate alternative tourism. But look, I was one of the first people to be involved in that area in the 1980s. And in 40 years, it's never gained any traction. It's a very minor blip on the radar screen. although in the academic literature, it gives a false sense of amplification that this is really a massive industry. It isn't. And in my opinion, it never will be. And to add insult to injury, I think that alternative tourism is not an alternative. It's an appendage of mass tourism, because it depends upon those very same mass systems of transit, of finance, of marketing, of communication that facilitate Las Vegas and the Riviera. That also is the same forces that facilitate the Eco Lodge by the indigenous group on the Amazon River. So it's a bit of a wake-up call that, you know, as academics, yes, in our ivory towers, we love to bleat about the importance of all these new forms of tourism, but the industry ignores us, and worse, the public has been ignoring that as well. And I don't think they're terribly interested in. Of course, there's small fringe groups, but that's such a tiny proportion of the market that it's really almost negligible. And if this changes, I'd be quite happy to see it, but I've turned into a real realist in the last 40 years. So I think this is a really positive thing to add to the concept of enlightened mass tourism, looking at valuescapes for individuals, organizations, and destinations. Accepting the idea that, look, I can't think of any radical paradigm shift to replace the existing money-making model. It's always going to be like that. And that's just the reality. But again, I'm very positive. I saw how tourism was developing so great. Now we have the first great collapse of all the systems that accelerated since 1950. So tourism has a lesson for all other human economies that accelerated and could also be facing a great collapse. So we have an enormous opportunity here, and I'll leave it at that. Lots here perhaps to discuss and debate, and thank you for your attention. I'll stop the thing there.
David, yeah, stop, thank you. So this was also a very great presentation with a lot of very important messages. I will in a bit summarize later your presentations. In the meantime, I will go ahead and presenting the next speaker. Dave, you were talking about the combination of the best characteristics of mass tourism with an alternative tourism. So I like this approach very much. And when you talk about alternative tourism, you are talking about ethical imperatives, but also about sensitivity. I like this very much. So I see it in the same way. So we are becoming very, very sensitive as a society on many levels, and the sensitivity to place and community it's part of that. And I'm sure that Anna will now show us also some examples. Anna Scutari is professor for empirical research at the Munich University of Applied Sciences and has been a senior researcher at the Center for Advanced Studies of EURAC Research, the European Academy of Bolzano, a research institute in the most northern province of Italy since 2012. She studied in Trento in Italy and holds a doctoral degree in economics from the Catholic University of Eichstätt-Ingolstadt. She is also, next to her professorship, coordinating the Sustainable Tourism Observatory of South Tyrol, so the most northern province of Italy, a monitoring instrument belonging to the INSTO network of Sustainable Tourism Observatories of the UNWTO. And Anna will show us how implement, in a way, a sustainable mass tourism concept in a region which is highly touristified and from a touristic point of view, very intensive. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this presentation, and thank you for inviting me. I was pleased to hear a lot of interesting thoughts before this short example of our monitoring observatory of South Tyrol. I would like to start with a very brief overview of what we will try to cover in this 15 minutes I've got as a maximum limit for today's presentation. On the one hand, I would like to start with a thought coming from several different publications of David Weaver around mass tourism as an emergent norm. I'll then introduce global and local dynamics very briefly, just to highlight how this very small example of South Tyrol can be linked to a more to a bigger network and to a bigger effort to change the entire tourism system and tourism ecosystem at local level and at global level at the same time. I will then introduce some experiences, some perspectives on measuring, and some experiences we've learned, some lessons we've learned along our journey of the observatory to give a final conclusion. But let me start from what we know. So sustainability. Well, if we think about mass tourism, we take for granted that it's a type of tourism that has to do with large numbers. But originally in the literature around mass tourism started, I would say it started earlier, but the most contributions started along the end of the 90s with this idea of having large numbers, standardization, and a kind of collective organization of the travel, which brings in some economies of scale, some efficiency, some positive aspects, and also, of course, some negative aspects. If we think about sustainable mass tourism as an emergent norm, as it is stated here, we need to focus also on the fact that sustainability for mass tourism is not just a matter of measurement and measuring. It's really a strategic option for the destination. This aspect of strategic management to balance costs and benefits is a very important one, I think. And it's exactly where the monitoring part comes in and supports policymakers. Thinking about sustainable mass tourism means thinking about, on the one hand, volume and regulation. This is the well-known Weaver matrix. I don't want to spend more time on that, but I would like really to stress the fact that with an observatory, you need to monitor, on the one hand, volumes, but you need to monitor also the regulation system and the effects of that regulation. But we are at the very beginning of the regulation of masses. So we're now trying out different instruments, no matter if they're market-based or if they're command and control, if they're voluntary measures. Okay, we're trying them out. We don't know how they are working on site. And that's why monitoring is, on the one hand, important to monitor impact, but on the other hand, also to focus on regulation. Finally, a third introductory thought, we can have different paths towards sustainable mass tourism in that we regulate before or after the volumes are booming. But in the end, we need to take into account that we need also to, besides the efficiency and the cost benefit analysis, to take into account the maximum limits at destination level and the vulnerability of the entire system. And I think that's the same direction of the previously mentioned enlightened mass tourism. So not just to think about efficiencies and cost benefit analysis, but also to think about the maximum limits of growth at local level. Let me just use this introduction to highlight some major implementation gaps that exist. In my opinion, it's not about just only the attitude behavior gaps. So consumers are not actually doing what they would need to do. It's more about a monitoring gap. We were not able yet to have a very comprehensive monitoring of sustainable tourism and sustainable mass tourism. And it's a policy implementation gap. This is highlighted by UNWTO, analyzing 101 policies all over the world at national level and stating that all of them introduces sustainability as a guiding principle, but just 11% are capable of monitoring and providing regular reports on that. So we're really having a big failure in this sense. So what's the exit strategy? Well, the exit strategy, in my opinion, is that we are able to monitor not just the drivers of mass tourism. We all know that there is a digitalization, there's better system of transport. There are many different drivers for masses being on travel, but we need to measure better pressures, states, impacts, and responses from destinations. So these drivers, pressures, states, impacts, and response, this DPSIR system was introduced for environmental science, but I think it highlights the different steps that we need to cover to have a better view of the over-tourism problem and that might come out based on mass tourism. So it's not about just counting or measuring the CO2 emission, the congestion, and so on. It's really trying to figure out how these pressures can affect or can have an impact on the quality of life, on the quality of the environment, and finally, how they can result in sometimes anti-tourism demonstration or tourist segregation and many different types of effects. So finally, it's also about monitoring the response. And today I would like to highlight this part on the response. So how to implement sustainable tourism the right way. At global level, we have a lot of different initiatives, including a monitoring system that cover the entire globe, including networking activities, business activities, global standards, and a lot of academic outputs. These are just the books that were published in 2018, 19, 20, and 21. So over the last 4 years around over-tourism and mass tourism. I would like to highlight these networking initiatives because this is the part the observatory is in. Among the different initiatives by UNWTO, there is one which is very important to us, and this is the INSTO network of observatories. So there are 32 observatories all over the world at the moment, and we are one of these observatories. And they are trying to monitor the local situation in terms of sustainability. There are many different destinations with different development paths. Some of them are mass tourism destinations, some of them are at the very beginning of their development stage. But the idea is to create a global network of very local initiatives. And I think that is a great opportunity to see that we all face the same challenges and we need to find place-specific solutions. We can't basically use someone else's solutions to cope with local problems. At local level, I've just picked some examples of our observatory of South Tyrol and other observatories. We have also many different initiatives, including certification schemes that are, I would say, increasing over the last decades, sustainability communities, many awards or certified businesses, and also measurement initiatives. And now let me talk about the region I'm representing here at the moment, South Tyrol, which is a very tiny and small region in the northernmost part of the Italian Alps. As you can see from the picture, it's a very pristine nature. And we also have a natural UNESCO World Heritage Site on site and a lot of immaterial heritage, including one that is also recognized from UNESCO as immaterial World Heritage. We have 500,000 inhabitants, so not that many. And we have more than 33 million overnights in a normal pre-COVID year. In 2020, we had 21 million overnights with a decrease of 35%. I've just checked the figures of July 2021, and it seems that in July to 2021, we had more overnights than in July 2019. That means that bounce back will be probably quicker as we expect, and there is a need, therefore, to cope with regulation and initiatives to sensitize the local stakeholders in order not to get back to the status quo of pre-COVID. What about the observatory? The observatory is an instrument that was developed in 2018 after a first screening of local needs of stakeholders around sustainability and, of course, the parallel consideration of the global sustainable development goals and their application to tourism. The idea is that we contribute at global level with better knowledge about how to implement sustainable tourism. And on the other hand, we also contribute to the local level by supporting decision makers. Indeed, we are supporting now the creation of the new development plan for the region based on the data of the observatory itself. Over the last 3 years, what we did was a systematic and timely and regular monitoring of tourism at municipality level. We have 116 municipalities, and we have in total at the moment 31 indicators. So it's a huge number of indicators if you consider we have them on, most of them we have on a local scale. We have covered all the dimensions that were mentioned by the UNWTO as mandatory issue areas, and we have added some more. I'll show you in a minute. And we've tried to set up a website in which we publish data, and you can figure out how the performance is in a more comprehensive way. So the idea is to shift from conventional tourism statistics, including overnight stays, arrivals, and maybe expenditures, and to have some more complex statistics, including also a lot of different aspects. We do also some networking activities, including participation to global and local meetings, but that's not the right place to talk about them. Let me just show you the different monitoring fields. You can imagine for each of these monitoring fields, we have 1 to 3 indicators. We set up a maximum of 3 indicators. 1 should be a very general one, and 2 can highlight specificities of the issue area. And from 2022 on, we will also cover climate action and accessibility as a mandatory indicator of UNWTO. What's the challenges? So what are the difficulties we had? What are the main challenges we had to face? On the one hand, the multidisciplinary nature of the monitoring scheme. And I'll show you an example in a few seconds. It's been very difficult, even if we do have an expertise in tourism, it's becoming more and more difficult to monitor the performance of tourism if you get out from the economic dimension. So the more you have to monitor ecological issues or social issues, the more you need expertise. And this expertise I want to highlight is not there even if you go to the corresponding disciplines. So if I'm talking to experts of natural hazards or experts of biodiversity, they can't create this link to tourism immediately. So this bridge needs to be created at the moment of creating the observatory. The local understanding of sustainability. So it's very difficult to use all the dimensions of sustainability at local level because the environmental dimension sometimes is the most important or perceived as the most important one, and many others are not at all considered. And finally, how to link this monitoring, this 31 indicators with policy making. So you need to have timely and useful data to get there at the right moment with the right data and communicate this right data in the proper way. It was, we produce this wonderful report every year. It's 100 pages with a lot of explanations and detailed graphs, but we noticed that this type of output is not useful for a policymaker. They need to have much quicker information and much timely information. So that's why there is a challenge in there between the quality of the work and the quick responses for policymakers. And on the other hand, some indicators just highlight a trend line. They're not linked to a specific target because the target needs to be set by the politics. And now we're trying to set up in the 3rd years of the observatory this direct link between our monitoring, our trend line, what's been going on in the indicators over time, and what do we want to achieve with that indicator. That's a very challenging moment. And of course, we've adapted the indicators a lot. And here you see an example. We started the monitoring of space consumption using a very standard indicators used in spatial planning. This is the Shannon's Evenness Index. And we were pretty much criticized because this index is good in considering the use of land at general level, but it's very bad to consider the effect of tourism on the use of land, since other different types of sectors, including the industry and mostly the agricultural sector, they are affecting the use of land in a different way. So we could not use this indicator anymore, and we had to think about new indicators. For instance, here you see a new indicator recalculated with GIS systems to highlight how urban sprawl was happening due to tourism. So we basically located the different hotels and tried to figure out whether they were inside the village or outside. Because if they were outside, they were using the land and the green land, and it was not a good idea at local level, of course. Therefore, I think it's important to contextualize every indicator. A second thing we've learned, here you see two graphs that seem to be very, very similar, but they highlight a very interesting aspect. And I'm coming to an end. I know I have just a few minutes more. On the left hand, you see the energy, the electricity consumption in accommodation facilities. On the right hand, you see the waste consumption. These are estimates. You see also how big was the impact of the pandemic, looking at the figures in 2020. But the interesting fact is that if we just consider 2008 to 2009, and we consider the percentage change, we see that with plus 22% of overnights, we have a lot more of energy consumed than the increase in overnights, and a little bit less of waste. That has to do with the economies of scale. This data show basically that by changing the type of infrastructure and by having better hotels, because the hotels have become better, there was a huge investment in the quality of hotels. We have a better star system of our hotels, but on the other hand, we consume pretty much more energy, okay? Because we have bigger rooms, we have a little bit more of an investment for wellness facilities and so on. Whereas the management of waste becomes better if the hotel becomes bigger, because there are some efficiencies there. So these are things we've learned, and they're very precise and tiny, and we wouldn't have learned them without having looked at data in a specific way. And finally, the last example, we did also some surveys in our observatory, and we compared, for instance, perceptions. So it's not just about numbers and objective measures, it's also about perceptions. Here you see the perception of local experts of history, local analysts, and local tourism boards about the effect of tourism on culture. And if you just look at the dark green side of it, you see that there are a lot of differences in perception. Let me just pick one. Culture and tourism benefit from each other. The statement was perceived in a completely different manner from tourism boards rather than from municipal analysts. So this kind of comparisons about the perceptions are very important to us. Let me conclude with some highlights. At first, the assessment of impacts we did was good. So we did a lot of work, but we perceive we need to do more in the overall measurement of the impact per capita, so per tourist, and also per tourist market. So we need to just try to aggregate those data, because otherwise we have a lot of figures, a lot of different ways of showing data, but we don't have any final information for policymakers. And we believe that sustainability could be a guiding principle even for market selection, to select those markets that are more or consuming less or more sustainable. We need to consider local vulnerabilities as a limit, and that define some thresholds behind this so-called cost-benefit analysis that we can do at local level. And we should introduce not only command and control measurements, so the normal type of rules, but also market-based solutions and voluntary measures. Indeed, the destination is trying to get a certificate according to the global standards of GSTC. So there is an attempt to go also for voluntary measures and engagement. And finally, the missing link between monitoring and policy intervention should be addressed with really adequate stakeholder involvement, and I'd say with adequate communication systems to transmit the results of all this huge work of monitoring, and not just linking the indicators to the goals, but also using the existing goals that regional or international organizations have given to define new indicators or better indicators that can show how far we are from where we want to be. Thank you very much, and sorry for being a little bit longer than it was expected.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. So please, okay, wonderful. Yeah, I'm so happy because we only have wonderful presentations, and if we want to implement that, what Richard and Dave were telling us and showing us, then monitoring, as you, Anna, described, in order to create policies, minimize tourism-related costs and maximize benefits would be an interesting approach. So thank you for this presentation. At the end of your presentation, you were talking about the effects of tourism on culture. And this is now the link to Professor Elena Borin. Last but not least, Elena is a professor in Rome. She is a professor, an associate professor for the Link Campus University in Rome. Previously, she was a director of the Master in Arts and Cultural Management, and coordinator of the research team in Arts and Cultural Management at the Burgundy School of Business in Dijon in France. And her research activities, they are mostly around culture, cultural entrepreneurship, public-private partnership in the cultural and creative sector, cultural tourism, governance and sustainability. And so I guess that this is the missing link which we need. So my central question, Elena, would be, can culture be a special driver for the transformation? Dave was talking about a transformation described right before in the presentations. Elena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Harald, for inviting me, first of all, to this very interesting panel, but also for giving me the possibility, the chance to listen to all these interesting presentations that were made by the presenters before me. Actually, some of the themes that emerged during the previous presentations, such as the culture, the importance of culture for tourism, but also the need for, let's say, a reflection on the transformation in terms also of integrating and appreciating multiple perspectives on implementing our ability to engage in a continuous learning, in becoming more sensitive to communities. So these are all themes that really emerge also in the reflection on cultural leadership and cultural tourism. So we'll try to share my screen. So here it is. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay.
In the meantime, I invite the audience to make questions with the chat function. Yeah? We will have a short break. Kazem will show us a video after Elena's presentation, and we should definitely have a couple of minutes for discussion. So please start to make questions via the chat function. Elena, back to you.
Thank you. So my reflection in this panel is mainly centered on cultural leadership in what we call transition tourism, which is a topic that actually is really at the center of the debate in cultural and creative organizations. And it's related to the fact that we are in a moment in which there is a transformation, sort of, because we are still deciding if we are going back to the old normal or if we are creating a new normal. So it's still debatable, of course, but actually we are all reflecting on what we can do next. So how can we shape the scenarios after the pandemic context? And among cultural organizations, cultural leadership is a big theme because we consider it as maybe a new approach, a new perspective in interpreting this transformation. And we are also reflecting on the link of this between this big theme of cultural leadership in the way we approach tourism, and in particular, cultural tourism, so tourism to cultural destinations with cultural purposes. Before starting, I would like just to point out what we are talking about. So what do we mean when we talk about cultural leadership? So the cultural leadership is a concept that is not new. It emerged in the 1990s. And it was evolving through time. It has evolved through time. In particular, at the beginning, it was considered as a reflection on the leadership inside cultural and creative organizations. So the leadership styles and the leadership values that were embedded in cultural and creative organizations. While now it has evolved to become something different. So it's more related to a reflection on the processes, of the leadership processes, inside and outside cultural organizations, implemented by cultural leaders. So basically, it's a reflection, it's an approach that underlines the role of cultural and creative organizations, artists, cultural leaders, in the process of shaping society and influencing society. So it's also at the center of the reflection that cultural and creative organizations are carried out on the concept of development. So how can cultural leadership lead to a new concept of development that is based on specific values that are related to cultural and creative organizations? So recently, this concept of cultural leadership has been linked to the concept of cultural and creative ecosystems. So cultural and creative ecosystems is an interpretation of territories as an ecosystem of different actors, such as public authorities, the different community stakeholders, associations, citizens, the different economic sectors of the society. But most of all, they interpret territories as places where cultural and creative industries, cultural and creative organizations are acting. And they are also reflecting a series of values that are values related to the place. So the values of a place in this approach are mainly cultural values, interpreted as interpreting culture as in a broader concept, okay, in a broader approach. So culture is not just artistic outputs, but is really the values of a community, the traditions of the community, the spirit of a place, the genius loci, to use this new expression, this very important expression. So cultural and creative industries in this landscape of values who play a bigger role in connecting the different stakeholders and actors in the territory, and most of all, being the ones that some extent promote the cultural values of the place. And they are also the ones who enhance the link between the different communities and actors to these cultural values. And this is something that is also relevant in terms of tourism. Okay, so cultural leadership can be a key to interpret our way out from overtourism. So it could be interpreted it has been discussed, but it could be interpreted also as a tool to overcome overtourism. Especially taking into consideration that mass tourism and overtourism are dangerous for all types of destinations, but they are also particularly dangerous for cultural destinations, because they can really damage local cultural heritage. They can damage the genius loci. Think, for example, in the case of Venice, okay, you have 55,000 inhabitants and 120,000 tourists per day. So the ratio is very clear. It's something that is menacing also the spirit of a place, the authenticity. It was something that Richard was talking about in his presentation. So cultural organizations are, since they are also the protagonists of cultural destinations, they are reflecting on how to change this situation. And one of the main attempts that they have made is the one related to redirecting tourists from the big, main cultural tourism attractions to minor, let's say, less known cultural attractions. So cultural destinations that are located in the city, but also cultural destinations that are located in the territory. So this is something that was really, developing. It was really developing a lot before the pandemic. I put here some of the cases related to the Italian context. So this one is the case of Venice. There was a specific project that was called Hidden Jewels of Venice, which was promoted by an association, a foundation that was Foundation Venice Venezia Servizi, so a foundation that was dealing with different services in Venice. And they were like creating new itineraries inside the city of Venice with that were aiming to discover places that were were not open to the public. So outside the traditional visits. So this was the case of Venice. There were cases all over the world. It was something that was well established. One of them was, for example, the project Terre degli Uffizi, that was promoted by the Uffizi Museum in Venice. So, you know, it's one of the biggest museums in Venice, with very long queues to enter and very famous. Basically, this museum has a lot of artworks that are in storage. They are not visible to the public. So the Uffizi Gallery decided to use these artworks and to lend them to different museums located in the territories, mainly small museums. So museums that are usually not visited by the public, and then to make a big campaign of promotion of this initiative in order to encourage the visitors to visit the part of the Uffizi Gallery also in other locations. This was a way to promote the territory, to promote also the local heritage. Tuscany is full of heritage, and sometimes everybody goes to the big destinations, but there are also minor destinations that are very important. And this was really an attempt to redistribute tourists in the territory in different cultural destinations. So these projects were really successful. They brought a lot of results, but actually they were all put, in a moment of standby during the pandemic. And the pandemic really changed all the games related to the cultural sector, cultural destinations. I will say in terms of tourism in general, but also in terms of cultural tourism. And for us in the cultural and creative sector, it was a moment of big reflection. First of all, because there was a strong push towards digitization, which was something that was not really familiar for us. Okay, and it requires a lot of effort. It requires also a lot of economic investment, financial investments we were not ready to take. So it was really a big push that was very difficult for us. And most of all, it was a paradoxical situation. There was a big demand for cultural and creative content, online, digitized during the lockdown period. But at the same time, the sector, the cultural and creative sector, was really strongly affected by the economic downturn related to the lockdown period. And it was really difficult, therefore, to digitize everything and to produce digital content in a situation of financial constraints. But anyway, it was a big push. Culture was also, for the first time, linked to well-being, health, social issues, but was something that was there also before, but it became very evident during the pandemic. And also, cultural creative organizations were demanded to create new ways to connect with their public and their communities in what were actually blended spaces. So online spaces, digital spaces, but also physical spaces, especially for local people, okay, that had the possibility to maybe make some local tourism during the period. And that really reinforced the idea of participation, the way communities participate and were involved in the cultural and creative organizations. Just some short examples. So at the beginning, all the cultural organizations basically organized online tours. This is the example of the Louvre, but you can find many other examples from the cultural and creative scene. Then we created exhibitions that were interactive and that were in the physical spaces and in the online space, in the digital spaces, in which audiences can basically create their own path autonomously. They can create their values in visiting the exhibitions. So it was really a different way of interpreting exhibitions. Then there were also several museums and cultural organizations that were trying to create new packages of activities for involving different types of publics. There was a lot of attention on children and people that were still in education, because of course, we all know during the lockdown, many schools were closed, and so there was a big demand for this. So this is an example that you can see in this slide of the National Gallery of Singapore. They created a specific package of activities that the children basically can do in their own homes, but based on material that was created in the National Gallery of Singapore and by the different peoples involved in that. And then, of course, there was also a more playful way of interpreting the role of cultural and creative museums during the pandemic. This is an example from LACMA, so Los Angeles County Museum of Art. You can basically download for free different artworks that were that are still part of the collections of this museum, and then use them as video conference backgrounds. And I can go on and on with different, there are really many examples of ways of making art more playful. So all these initiatives were important because they created connections. They kept connections with the public, either local public, tourists, or whatever kind of public these museums and organizations might have. And then at the end of the pandemic period, we are still in the pandemic period, I will say, but let's say last year, okay, there was also an increase in terms of co-designing cultural activities, co-designing and contributing contributions, exchanges between communities, professionals, different types of stakeholders, and the designing of cultural and creative initiatives. The biggest one was the new European Bauhaus, which was launched last year, and it was based on a co-design phase that is carried out basically online for the moment, but is becoming also physical in the future. So this was the pandemic scenario. We are still in the pandemic, but I think all the experiences we had so far can be really interesting for reflecting on what we are going to do next. So how can we design new scenario for tourism in cultural destination and based on the experiences that cultural and creative organizations had during the pandemic? So what we are seeing now is still early, but what we are seeing now is that in this almost post-pandemic period, there is a lot of reflections, okay, in understanding how culture and cultural organization can contribute to tourism, to local development in heritage cities and in heritage and cultural destinations. This is a lot of reflection. There are different conferences and events going on to reflect on these and to discuss these topics. But what we are seeing in very practical terms is that museums and cultural organizations and cultural destinations in general are not neglecting the experiences they had during the pandemic. First of all, with attention to new communities. I think it was Richard talking about having a family with kids and the importance that kids place, for example, on the exhibition, on the involvement, okay, and on the activities they can do. And that's why some museums are trying to implement specific collaborations with children. So they are taking into consideration the point of children. For the first time, I will say, even if there were some pilot projects before, that they are taking this perspective, the perspective of children, into consideration in a very important way. This is an example from a museum in Ghent, in Belgium. in which they created a new exhibition that is called the Little Catalog of the Smack Collection, which is actually an exhibition designed by children. So a group of children are curators of the exhibition. It means also that we create new narratives inside the typical museum access. Similar experiences are, for example, the one of the Uffizi. Okay, the Uffizi has just launched a new initiative for children. Okay, it's called Uffizi Kids. Okay, and basically kids are again at the center of the design, the activities proposed by a museum. This is special for the Uffizi. Uffizi is a very traditional museum, very, how to say, reluctant to change and specific kind of publics. But what I would like also to stress is that some of the mechanisms that were triggered during the pandemic are there to stay. Okay, this is, for example, the increase in online content access. During the pandemic, it was basically we were all accessing contents online, and among all the people, the results that you see here are the results of a survey carried out by the Australian Council for the Arts. So this report underlined that 29% of participants have discovered a new artistic or cultural organization online during the pandemic. But what is interesting is that over 4 in 10 audience members continue to participate in arts and culture online. 52% see a role of digital experience in the long term. So online and physical spaces are going to be blended, okay, are going to be interacting also in the future. And that is something that is, in my opinion, also pointing to the importance of cultural leadership in the after the pandemic, in the post-pandemic scenario, and the role of cultural organization in designing this leadership for also tourism. So what I would like to underline here is that cultural organizations have their experience is giving us important insights on what can happen after, okay, what can happen in the post-pandemic scenario. First of all, we need to pay attention to specific publics, also in tourism terms. Okay, family wants to travel together. That's something important, and we want also to create specific experiences also for specific type of public, such as kids. So we need to really rediscover the role of cultural organizations in this increasing demand. And also we can use all the values that we have found inside during the pandemic that are related to the culture and creative sector in terms of community involvement, in terms of sharing of resources, in terms of creating values for the territory, as values for designing new paths in the tourism sector afterwards. And then the other thing that I would like really to underline is that this use of digital spaces, okay? Several museums were really worried before the pandemic that creating digital contents and offering experiences to visitors online could damage the fact that tourists will come to their museums after, okay? This seems not to be the case, okay? Actually, digital spaces are enhancing the potential of physical spaces and also increasing the attention toward physical spaces, also to spaces that were previously not known, not used, okay? We saw the project of the Uffizi, so Terra degli Uffizi, is actually becoming bigger and bigger now, and they are launching a new strategy for the period 2021-2026, I think, so 5-year strategy, which is increasing also the net of museums that are involved in the project, and it's really also triggering new collaborations. So cultural organizations have played a key role during the pandemic. They could play also a key role in designing the transition phase to this new normal, also for cultural tourism. That's why there is big discussion also in terms of what is the leadership that they can have in designing this phase, in designing the new normal for cultural destinations. So of course, something that we can debate and something that is still in the making. So there's no clear answer in this, But maybe we can really reflect on all these experiences and try to catch what they can contribute, the contribution they can have for the future. So I'll leave you with this question, and of course, feel free to contact me and to discuss with me after the break, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you to all the speakers. I see some, well, let me say, some crucial aspects in our panel, which we could discuss a bit later. So when we started with the question whether there is existing a kind of excessive tourism, and well, many of you, I would say almost all of you, were talking about imbalances. Richard was saying, well, excess is a kind of luxury. So if we sell things too cheap, but at the same time, he was also saying we should go away from volume, but we should move to value. We should increase the impact of sustainability and ethical consciousness. David was talking about ethical imperatives in the context of alternative tourism, which we definitely need in combination with the best characteristics of mass tourism. At the same time, Dave was proposing a kind of transformative governance as accumulating incremental radical changes. Richard was talking about the need of a KPI system. Anna was showing us the monitoring system of the UNWTO with the case of South Tyrol, showing the importance of managing based on a monitoring system the tension between vulnerability and massive human presence on one hand and the destination only perspective on the other hand. Anna was citing Paul Peters in that regard. And last but not least, Elena showing us that culture can have a very special role in transforming and in creating a transition process in destinations. The culture, the so-called cultural leadership. I liked very much you're saying about rediscovering the cultural values in designing new developments for the territory in cooperation with the community in relation to the SDGs 2030. So there is a cultural leadership in cultural destinations, but I would even say in all the destinations, not only in cultural destinations. Culture should have a meta role, I would even say. But I guess you showed us in a very good way with a lot of examples how to deal with that. And so, at the meantime, we received some questions, but we will talk about them later. Now I give back to Kazem.
Thank you, Harold, and thank you all for such a wonderful symphony of presentations. I could really find how they are interlinked and integrated. I suppose everybody need a couple of minutes break. And so let's watch a video. Meanwhile, please move your bodies, grab your drink, and come back for the beautiful question and answer session that we will have after the video.
I have to
Yes.
I have to leave now because it's 8 p.m. here, and I have 3 or 4 things I have to do before I go to bed. So unfortunately, okay. I have to leave now.
So maybe we just skip the video and continue, David?
No, I think I better get some stuff done.
Okay. Thank you very much, David. And we
okay.
Thank you very much, Dave.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. You know,
tourism will again partner with recovery for livelihoods and more resilient societies. We will restore confidence only by working together. Trust is our new currency to restart tourism and contribute to the wider recovery.
I hope everybody is back. We have Harold here, and if you let me, Harold, I read the couple of questions in the chat, or you would prefer to go with them?
Yeah, I'm with the presentations. Sorry, with the questions in the chat. And,
yes, please.
There is another one by Richard also. So Anna, this is a special request to you on the long-term implementation perspectives, but eventually you can also give an answer, a short answer to the other question. Are there specific rules to balance between mass tourism and carrying capacity rules? This was a question by Arancho Mendonça, Emmanuel. Anna.
Thank you very much for the question. I think this is the most difficult question to answer of the entire webinar today. It would be easy to balance these two things if we had a perfect measurement of tourists and same-day visitors and the maximum capacity that is available or acceptable on site, as if we were in a museum or in a theater with some specific slots to sell and a maximum limit of people inside. It becomes very difficult when we consider destinations as places and regions. I think the most easy way of doing this balance between masses or mass tourism and carrying capacity is limiting the number of beds, and this is the classical style to find an upper limit of the overnighting possibilities. But on the other hand, if we consider that on average in the Alps, the occupancy rate of those beds is quite low. So for instance, we have an occupancy rate ranging between 20 and 40% of the total occupancy possibility, then we know that giving a maximum limit to beds is not enough, because beds are not full and there is always a room to increase growth, even if we have stopped the development of new beds. So the only thing that we found as a possible option to balance this aspect when it comes to social sustainability is the monitoring of the local satisfaction. And this is a project we were developing together with Harald at the Center of Advanced Studies in the project I was mentioning before, which uses some aspects of the observatory, but tries to define a plan for the future of tourism in 2030 in our region. And exactly there, together with the Curtin University of Australia, we were developing together with Harald Bechlaner a questionnaire directed to the specific regions and local inhabitants to monitor perceptions. So I think monitoring perceptions is the right way to at least cope with social impacts of tourism on site. On the other hand, of course, we should much more focus on the environmental aspects, and this is a monitoring that takes place in a more quantitative way. But the difficult point is really to set, to find out which is the threshold. So with local inhabitants, you can do it with a questionnaire. I think this can be an answer. With the environment is pretty much more difficult, because it's difficult to distinguish between the effects on nature made up by tourism and the effects on nature made up by other practices. For instance, in our land, agriculture has a great impact on nature, and we cannot distinguish between the two sectors and how they affect the natural environment. I hope I have try to
yeah,
answer.
Definitely. That's great. Richard, eventually you can also make another question, but in the meantime, I would only come back to Elena and give her the floor, because Yusuf was asking, in your opinion, how can traditional museum act according towards mass tourism?
Right, so I think for traditional museums, probably you are meaning big, large, famous museums. So museums like the examples I took, so Uffizi Gallery or I don't know, Galleria dell'Accademia in Venice, or over big museums in over international cities, important cities. So of course, these big museums have a big role to play, okay? Because actually they are the preferred destinations of cultural tourists. So usually they are the destinations where mass tourism is concentrating, okay? So they traditionally acted just by limiting the number of visitors, so to a specific amount that corresponded to their current capacity. But this, I think it's not really working. First thing, because they really, they are to some extent accepting a carrying capacity that is a little bit above the real carrying capacity. So basically inside the different rooms of the museums, there are always a lot of people, and this really damages the authentic experience that also Richard was talking about, okay? There is a lack of authenticity in these experiences. So what we can do, in my opinion, is really to try to partner with other museums, with other destinations inside the territory. And this is something that is also implicit in all the examples that I quoted. So we partner with other museums, with other cultural attractions in the territory that are less known. They create packages in order to make advertise really the beauty of these other museums. Or they can dislocate some of the works, artworks, I mean, in the other museums, such as in order to create a different experience. Okay, you can see the same artworks in a different locations. This is something that is really a new path, but in my opinion, it's working. It could work also in the future. And then the other thing that I also underlined in my presentation is really digital. Okay, many museums. I'm thinking of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, which was one of the pioneers of the digitization of artworks. So they are creating also the possibility to access to artworks online, and they are also allowing the different visitors to create their own experience previously before the real physical visit. Just it's not overcrowded, such as they create already a path inside the museum itself. These are all mechanisms that are influencing also tourism, redistributing tourists inside the city, inside the territories, and distributing also tourists inside these big museums. We need really to change the mindset, because otherwise we will have always long queues at the Louvre Museum and 100 people in front of the Gioconda. You know, it's not working. we need to change that. People are more sensitive. There are also sensitivity to the communities, and so I think everything is changing.
Yeah, thank you, Elena. Yusuf, you have a question regarding Elena's discussion. So please make the question. Can you hear, Yusuf?
Maybe he's writing.
I need to change her font that she can.
In the meantime, I ask the panelists, since we will slowly to give us an overall perception of the results of the seminar. So.
Yeah, I can hear you. Thank you so much for such an informative webinar. This is about the big museum, which has the facilities, has the financial support. But if we are talking about museum in developing country, which is totally rely on this kind of visits, the tourist attraction? What should they can do and how they can deal with such situation? Because if we are talking only about developed country and museum which has a financial resource, we have also to think about developing country with museum. Maybe they are crowded. They are not that much big, but they are so crowded because of their location, such as the Cairo Museum. So how can we deal in that situation?
So thank you, Youssef. This is a very good question, actually. So we are always talking about museums in developed countries, but of course we need to carry out a reflection also in museums in maybe countries that are not so developed, and in the global south countries, of course. In my opinion, that's I really underline this is my opinion. I think they have the possibility to really trigger development paths based on the on the mistakes of the museums in developed countries. So by observing, what has been going on in developed countries museums, we can also design new approaches in these museums that are located in over type of countries. I am referring especially to the power of partnerships. So of course the Cairo Museum has a lot of visitors and it's a main source of income and it's an important source of income for the museum. But if we interpret the museum as an isolated institution, is not working. You need to interpret it also in connection with the territory, in connection with the broader communities that are operating in the territory. If you interpret it as isolation, you are happy to have so many tourists because it's a source of income, but you are forgetting that there is a bigger territory in which the museum is operating, and that actually you need to enhance the whole territory. And in my opinion, this comes again to the problem of values. So what are the values that we can promote as cultural organizations? Cultural leadership is about values that are, enhancing the communities at large, sharing resources. It's about humanity. It's about the values of trust that have been also highlighted by Dave in his presentation. So if we keep everything for just a museum because we are happy that we have this source of income, is not working. Instead, if we're not promoting the values, it's not cultural leadership, it's just leadership and management and administration in the traditional terms. If we want cultural leadership, really cultural leadership, we need to promote cultural values that are not just for one organization, but are for all the territory. It's a change of mindset that is, I think, already almost established in some countries. I was working in France. This is something that is, it's really taking a momentum, having a momentum in France. That maybe is not so obvious in other destinations, but I think we need to think about it and, of course, try to see if it applies and how we can apply it also in this type of museums and cultural destinations.
Thank you.
I don't know if I answered.
And thank you for the questions, Youssef. So let us come to an end. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to know from the panelists, Richard, Anna, and Elena, now what you learned, what you take with you from this seminar. So what is an insight or an experience or learning which could be important for all of us, but definitely also for your personal development. Richard.
Thank you, Harald. Well, as you know, that every business, every corporation has more KPIs than just revenue figures. Revenue figures don't tell you whether you're in a healthy state or not. Destination tourism does not have these kind of KPIs. And I was very interested and encouraged what I saw from Anna, that again there is the toolboxes are emerging and developing for these KPIs, but this is a complex scientific monitoring process. I'm a sole evangelist for the last 30 years that destination tourism needs KPIs other than visitor numbers in order to steer, to monitor, and to improve their system. And I kind of would like to know, or I would like to lobbying that destinations became to a state of ownership, that they say we need this kind of 5 or 10 other KPIs rather than numbers in order to monitor our state and development in terms of the 3 aspects of sustainability. Because the toolbox is there, but as we all know, there is no lack in the world of strategy documents. There is no lack in the world of concept papers. There is a lack in execution, and key to execution is ownership. As long as tourism executives or policymakers are not actually committed to implement these kind of KPIs, the research is kind of taking place in its own bubble. And I would like to address this to the audience and to the academic community, how we come from the existing toolbox and monitoring tools to the reduced implementation of KPIs in order to make tourism a better world after the pandemic. I see that things are happening. I think that our research does exist. And I hope, according to David's concern, that things will also arrive in the tourism community to get implemented. And this I take away from the seminar, that the scientific world has prepared a lot of toolboxes, but there is an evidence gap in the implementation aspect.
Thank you, Richard, for the clear words. You were talking about execution and the ownership. This is, I guess, is a very important keyword, ownership. In implementing the KPIs, and talking finally about the lack of evidence, but evidence-based decision-making definitely is, I think, a guiding rule for all these monitoring projects. Step by step are developed, and I guess Anna showed us that it is just the beginning of an interesting road which we have to go in the next years and decades, just in order to make tourism much more professional than it is today in terms of governance and management and organization. Anna, the floor is yours. What is the message you take with yourself, and what is the learning you had from this seminar?
Thank you very much, Harald. Maybe I just add on the reflection of Richard around how to cope with the implementation. I was present, I was participating to the global INSTO meeting. So this is the meeting of all the observatories of the world belonging to the network. And there was a very nice presentation from an external expert. This is a PhD graduate student or a postdoc researcher at the University of Surrey. I will maybe put also the link of this event here in the chat room. Maybe it's interesting for the one or the other. And she was giving a presentation on maximizing the influence of sustainable indicators towards systemic change. And she mentioned that the only way to implement is to focus on those indicators, on those KPIs that are felt as a priority at local level. And only then, if you are able to implement decisions around those KPIs that are perceived as important, you can then really go on implementing change in other fields that are not perceived at the very beginning as important topics. So this is maybe an approach. I also think that as a researchers, we have the ethical imperative of proposing even topics that are not really on top of the agenda of local policymakers. but that was exactly what she was recommending based on a lot of empirical research around this. What I've learned is that we probably have similar challenges, we have similar thoughts, but probably we don't have still the tools to change the system. There was a nice mention of about creativity and the use of creativity. I think it was David Weaver mentioning that, the use of creativity to change the status quo, to make this transformation, to make this transformational governance happen. We've been working on that a little bit with a specific gaze in our South Tyrolean region, in which we try to use also design instruments to encourage lateral thinking and not just think in a rational way. So probably rational thinking is not the proper way of implementing sustainable tourism. Probably we need some disruptive techniques that I still don't know, or still can't figure out in a precise manner. But we need those systems, and probably we can learn a lot from the cultural sector how to implement those things.
Thank you, Anna. And talking about disruptive techniques, thank you for that, Anna. I have a good possibility now to move to Elena and tell her that the cultural sector will probably be the decisive sector when we go to transform, when we go to implement a transformative governance, as David Weaver was showing us. Elena, what about the cultural sector now?
Oh, yeah, well, I just start with last moment of our panel by again thanking everybody for their inputs and their also perspective, that were different perspective and really enriched, I think, the discussions we had. Culture, yes. What I noticed in all the presentation is that culture, either mentioned directly or indirectly, was one of our underlying topics. Okay, culture also in terms of values, in terms of trust, in terms of approach also, because as I was underlining, the cultural sector is moving towards the fact that several multiple perspectives must be integrated inside the designing of activities, also cultural activities. So this is actually, I think, one of the major results of this panel. And it really resonates with me also all the reflection on the transformative governance that David Weaver was really putting forward. It's like, how can we design this transformative governance approach? It's an organic process, as he was saying. It implies the ability to integrate perspective, embrace uncertainty, experiment, and keep on learning. So engage in a process of continual reflective learning that is based on the trust, okay, humanity, tolerance, curiosity, so a set of values that are also embedded in the cultural sector. I just want to point out that we talk about sustainable development in 3 dimensions. So social, environmental, economic dimensions. That is the traditional one. But as you know, the debate is getting bigger, and the cultural and creative organizations are trying to promote a new approach that is based on 4 dimensions. So social, environmental, economic, and cultural dimension. And they are promoting the fact, they are trying to underline the fact that the cultural dimension is underlying and transversal also to the other dimensions. So that's maybe also interesting in terms of KPIs, in order to have a different set of KPIs. And that is, of course, related to all the reflection and work that Anna has done. And thank you again for your work. It was really interesting. And that also Richard was mentioning and was commenting and reflecting on. So it was really stimulating, I think. I hope it was a moment also for devising new strategies, also for research. So it could be also a new approach to research. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much to Richard, Anna, Elena, but obviously also to David. Since I summarized after your presentations, I should I should not do it again. It's about imbalances, it's about sustainability, and it's about resilience. Definitely, Richard made a question, does it make sense to restore an obsolete system? Well, we need a transformative governance, as David was proposing, and tools and KPIs, but also values, a set of values, a specific culture, transforming the idea of tourism into something new. And I'm sure that we are going in that direction. And so this was basically also the idea then to compose the panel as we did today. So thank you very much again to all of you. Thank you very much to Kazem Wafadari. Thank you very much to Jafar Jafari, who invited me to start with the activities in the context of SCoT webinars. And now, Kazem, back to you, back to Japan.
Thank you, Harald, and your team. Everybody definitely was right to the point. I could learn a lot from you and Richard when you started talking about the adaptation and resiliency yourself, Harald, and when Richard brought it to authenticity and sustainability. And I saw that Anna brought it to more management point of view with monitoring and indicator development, and the specific term of cultural aspect that Elena mentioned. So I see all of you are pointing the same body, which is the destination. So destination as a whole has these functionality, and to make the destination more sustainable and authentic, as Richard mentioned, or more resilient in the pandemic or in the vulnerability context, because vulnerability can be a trend or a shock. So this pandemic is a shock. So what type of destination we are expect, how we are going to monitor these different parts. So maybe my last point, and I know it's too long to continue this, but still our audience are here and they're listening. So maybe I also saw the word DMO, Destination Management Organizations. So do you think that these destination management organizations should play the key role, and we have to target them as a mediator for this process that I can call it resiliency and sustainability? My question is to all of you and yourself, Harald, if you give me the final remark on this.
Yeah, thank you, Kazem. This is a central question, no doubt. I guess, allow me to say that DMOs, with today's understanding, will not be able to create a transformative governance as we need. Why that? Because the classical DMOs are traditionally only managing touristic networks. And as I understood today from Richard, David, Anna, and Elena, we need a broader idea of management of networks, and especially the culture sector is showing us, and the creative sector is showing us that networking has another meaning too. So the old traditional creating networks in the field of tourism is not enough in order to change the world as we need to do it. So I guess that DMOs need a new perspective and a new view. Anna was talking about disruptive techniques. I do not see the knowledge of disruptive techniques in the DMO management and governance systems. But I guess that the culture sector has to be, let me say, very, very propositive and to show us, and I guess it was Anna was telling us, that the rational way alone is not enough. We need the disruptive techniques, and the culture sector knows a lot about disruptive techniques and the new perspectives. So I guess we have to transform the DMOs into organizations, into platforms, into value settings and frames, working with the disruptive techniques as a normal tool, and create a resilience, which has a new understanding, where we understand resilience as something where we cope with multi layers of crisis in a professional way. The climate crisis, the demography crisis, the several economic and financial crisis. But and obviously, last but not least, with COVID crisis, in order to use this as a chance, not to try to go back to the old school and the old system. The DMO will be decisive, but not in the condition as the DMO is to interpret today.
Thank you, Harold. Actually, this was my lesson take home, and I think DMOs are the workplace or the workshop that I can think of as a mediator place for all these presentations to be applied in DMO level as the mediator with the destination. Thank you very much. I learned a lot, and on behalf of SCoT and SCoT team, I would like to thank all of you for your passionate and very informative presentations. We hope to host you again in near future, and see you in another SCoT on another occasion. Thank you very much. And I, on behalf of the lead curator of SCoT, Professor Jafari, I thank all of the audience who spent the long, valuable time with us. See you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.